This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Gukesh taking on Anish Giri in the Tata Steel tiebreaks, the Blitz tiebreaks, to figure out who is going to face Wei Yi in the final tiebreaker match to determine the Tata Steel champion. And the players starting out with a positional opening, a Slav by Anish Giri, building that pawn triangle with the stronghold on d5. And Gukesh, he seizes the bishop pair early. This is all very well-known theory. In return for the bishop pair, black gets that early control of the h file. It's going to be a little bit difficult for white to castle kingside. And Anish Giri, with that move, rook to c8, he puts the rook on a closed file, but the rook is x-raying the white queen. And if Gukesh castles queenside, well, that's going to get quite scary as the c file opens up, and a pretty prescient decision there by Anish to store that rook on the now open c file, and a queen trade is offered. Gukesh moving his queen up to b3, attacking b7. Anish defending it. Will he trade queens here? A little bit of hesitation. As you can see, all of the spectators there lined up, trying to get the best view of this incredibly high-stakes game. The time control, 3 minutes per player. This is going to get really interesting as Anish Giri, he ponders whether or not to grab that queen on b3, and he decides not to. He plays the move a6. The downside of trading on b3 is that white would have had that excellent a file for his rook. And so Anish Giri is okay with the queen trade, but he wants to trade on his own terms, and so does Gukesh as he pulls his king up to e2, clearly anticipating that a queen trade is very likely to happen. And we have that impasse on the queen side. Who is going to be the first to flinch as Anish Giri completes his development with bishop d6, and a very careful response by Gukesh, simply bringing his pawn up to h3 and dulling the influence of the rook on h8. And finally, Anish Giri, he is the first to flinch, and he immediately strikes at the center with e5. White now has control of the a file, but much like black's control of the h file, its influence is greatly limited by that pawn chain that Anish has, with the pawns on b7 and a6 nicely defending each other. And the center has opened up. Black castles kingside, and Anish, he quickly gets his other rook into the game. Now the rooks are looking very, very nice, but as a result of the central trade, black has this weak pawn on d5. It's an isolated pawn, and Gukesh could try to surround it with his pieces. Will we see a trade on d3? No. Anish drops back with his knight to c6, maybe preparing to eradicate that weakness with d4, and Gukesh says, no way, Jose. No way, Anish, more precisely. And we see a very exciting fight for the d4 square. Looks like Gukesh wins this mini positional fight. Now he has complete control of the square in front of the isolated d5 pawn, which means that ultimately he has a target to attack. But currently the d5 pawn is very well protected, and Gukesh has a couple of weaknesses of his own as Anish Giri builds up his kingside pawn structure, grabbing some space. And a little bit of an impasse, both players trying to find, poking and prodding, trying to find weaknesses in the opposing side's territory. Gukesh pushes b4, trying to open up the b file, but he's created a big hole on c4. We skip forward a couple of moves here, bishop coming around to b3 and angling to attack that d5 pawn. The d5 pawn is still very well defended, but Anish has to decide how to arrange his rooks. Instead, he drops his knight back from e5. Gukesh preparing to double rooks on the d file. He has a very clear plan. He is going to put maximum pressure on that isolated pawn on d5. But look at how Anish has carefully arranged his knights, both of them symmetrically defending d5, and now he himself is putting pressure on white's backward pawn on c3. We've got an incredibly high-level positional battle here as both sides trying to find a way to make inroads, and Anish positions his knight on c4. Gukesh shifted his rook over to h1. He is clearly trying to open up the kingside with h4. Who is playing for the advantage here? The rook is centralized on d4. Gukesh is keeping his knight on e2. That is the only way to ensure the safety of the c3 pawn. Now Anish could have maneuvered his knight to b5, but instead he returns to home base. That knight firmly ensconced on c4, the players changing their positions. The rook drops back to d3. It feels like we've been in this position forever. Will we see a 3-time repetition? Looks like Anish is fine with a draw if Gukesh moves his rook up to d3. As the time is dwindling, will Gukesh go for it? He does. He trades on c4, and now we have only rooks and knights left. Looks like Gukesh is playing for the advantage. That knight on e2 is defending the rook on c1. Rook takes b4 would be a horrible blunder. Looks like a pretty balanced endgame to me, but in time pressure, anything can happen. The stakes could not be higher as Gukesh drags his king back to its initial square. He's probably going around to d2, trying to add an extra layer of reinforcement to that c3 pawn. And look at Anish Giri. All of a sudden, he's created a pass pawn on the side of the board. And a little bit of anxiety here from Gukesh. That A-pawn is incredibly menacing, but back goes the knight to D4. That is an excellent square. That is a good base of operations. And the knight jumps to B5. Now the battle shifts over to the A file. That pawn on A4 is isolated from the rest of the army. Has Anish Giri bitten off more than he can chew? Is the A-pawn a strength or a weakness? Both sides now under a minute as Gukesh pushes E4, creating more pressure on Anish Giri's pawn. The knight drops back to D4, but everything under control for Anish. The king on B7, very safe. Gukesh pushes E5, attacking the knight. Knight H5, excellent move by Anish. Here comes Gukesh's knight. To B5 it goes, threatening a fork on C6, and a very vigilant response by Anish, protecting the D5 pawn. The knight on D6 looks really, really good, but its lifeblood could be cut off if Anish pushes F6 at the right moment. That's a huge threat. That knight on D6, it's stranded, and the pawn on E5 is quite weak. Gukesh, with just seconds on his clock, he doubles rooks on the D file. Anish puts his knight on F4. F6, how does Gukesh save the knight? The pawn on E5 is undermined. He's got no time. Rook to B1. Is he trying to set up checkmate? There's nothing. Gukesh hesitating. He's got to move. He's losing his knight. Giri takes the knight. Anish is up a piece. That knight on D6 turned out to be the bane of White's existence. Now Anish is completely winning, but he needs to keep his composure with just a second on his clock. Look at the spectators, transfixed by what's going on the board. Anish pushing A3. He doesn't care about the pawns. All he cares about is finding a right square for his knight. That knight on D3. What a hero it is. Back it goes to C5. Gukesh is dead lost here. He's got no chances. Anish moves his rook to D2, initiating the mating sequence. Gukesh has to resign. What a positional battle as Anish Giri takes the first game of their Tata Steel tiebreaker. What a game. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.